Good evening. I am an anarchist, and I think you should be one too. I argue that a stateless society based on voluntary associations, or anarchy, is the most optimal social organization. Now, please suspend your immediate judgments for 10 minutes while I go into this claim with more detail. I have been interested in this topic for many years, read dozens of books, and spent many hours analyzing the nuances of anarchism. I was your run-of-the-mill conservative Republican pushing back against these radical ideas until the arguments ultimately convinced me. While the subject may seem purely hypothetical and impractical, it is absolutely relevant to you. Ultimately, governance, whether good, bad, legitimate, or illegitimate, will be determined by us and our posterity. It is our ideas that form the future of our societies. Nobody would be fully convinced of my seemingly radical claim based on one 10-minute speech. I definitely wasn't. It took years. But let me address a few arguments, explain some of my underlying assumptions, and then address some common counterarguments. Voluntarism, or anarcho-capitalism, is the most optimal social structure from both a moral and utilitarian perspective. Let me qualify the term anarchy first. Many falsely equate it with chaos, without rule or law of order. Anarchy actually comes from the ancient Greek word anarchia, which means without rulers. Under a system of anarchy, there are still rules, laws, order, and justice. In fact, I'd argue there's actually more of it. It merely means that the goods and services provided by governments today would be provided by other organizations in the market, based on voluntary exchange and competition, as opposed to coercion and monopoly. Take a look at Figure A. This is a simplistic way to analyze different political philosophies, which hinges on how many goods and services you think government should provide. Perhaps you are closer to my position than you might initially think. I argue that the market can and should provide services like transportation, police, security, courts, and protection from foreign enemies. I argue an anarchist society is more just, less abusive, and more responsive to people's needs than one based on governments. Anarchist social structure means all goods and services desired by individuals are voluntarily exchanged and subject to market competition. Governments force people to accept their services and use force to maintain their monopoly over goods and services. It is very costly to move to another country, so they feel very little competitive pressure. In the anarchist system, if one were dissatisfied with, say, a protection agency or arbitration company, they could simply switch to another agency at little cost. The voluntariness of the anarchist scheme makes it more just than a coercive system. And with the element of market competition, the anarchist system is less abusive and more responsive to people's needs than coercive monopolistic systems. I will demonstrate this in examples below. See Figure B. Economic theory teaches us that monopolies restrict output to socially suboptimal levels, while raising prices to levels that maximize its own profits. The lower total utility of society is represented in the graph as a deadweight loss. However, non-governmental monopolies must still embrace an innovation, be thrifty, and satisfy its consumers. With government monopoly, it is even worse because there are even less checks against abuse and inefficiency. They can resist innovation, waste large sums of money, ignore customer desires, and still stay in business. In fact, evidence shows that inefficiency and waste is often rewarded with more taxpayer money. No industry is immune to these socioeconomic principles, especially where government maintains a monopoly. For example, in 2001, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld admitted that $2.3 trillion in transactions were lost or unaccounted for. This would most likely cause a company in the private sector to close its doors due to shareholder accountability and competitive pressure. Instead, the defense budget got a massive raise. Now consider this. Expert R.J. Rummel has researched that modern governments around the world are responsible for killing hundreds of millions of their own people. This does not include any wars. It's just governments directly killing their own people. Is there no room for a debate in some other form of society? Why is the argument only which form of government, whether republic, democratic, fascist, communist, etc., is best, and yet there is no discussion of whether there should be government at all? This existing system you support also likely runs counter to your deeply held values. All of government's resources are acquired by taxation and the threat of force, which is basically extortion and therefore is immoral. Though portions of taxpayer money is used for reasons you might believe to be helpful, is it right to use threats of violence against peaceful individuals and force them to do what you think is right? Most of us feel uncomfortable about threatening peaceful people when we have to do it ourselves. But does it make it right for others to do it on our behalf because of a majority? Given some of these arguments, let me now explain some of their underlying assumptions and backing. Within these explanations, there will be additional grounds to support my claims. I am assuming governments have illegitimate authority. The social contract theory is false. Existing structures based on governments are illegitimate because nobody agreed to these systems. They are forced upon government subjects at birth. The social contract is not a valid agreement. There is no valid way to opt out. Moving to another country is very costly. There is no valid contractual obligation between parties involved. This is why an anarchist system, where customers of all goods and services sign contracts with their providers, is both just and legitimate. I also assume and argue that market competition is a powerful dynamic force that keeps organizations less abusive and more responsive to people's needs than monopolies. We see this principle on display in quote-unquote freer markets. A smartphone maker, like a defense agency or arbitration company in an anarchist system, will go out of business if it does not continually innovate and adequately serve its customers. Market competition continually weeds out inefficiency. While a natural monopoly might exist under rare conditions, it is still subject to strict budget constraints, mismanagement, and the possibility of potential competitors, which is unlike government monopolies. While market competition continually weeds out inefficiency, governments do the opposite. The post office loses money each year and it still stays in business while its private competitors do much better. The Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA killed 1,900 people in the aftermath of Katrina, yet they're still in business. No matter how badly these organizations do, they don't go broke and the system does not progress. Governmental organizations, one has to wait for an election, which is every few years and too widespread. The political ballot box is far less efficient than the consumer vote. Consumers have a much better handle on producers than voters do on politicians. Another assumption is that humans are selfish, but they're not sociopaths. They're rational. Most people spend money on satisfying trivial desires that could potentially save lives elsewhere in the world. In other words, people value their own welfare perhaps 1,000 times more highly than they value the welfare of strangers elsewhere in the world. However, many voluntarily donate money to charity, and most are prepared to make great sacrifices for loved ones. Only sociopaths lack the respect for social norms and the capacities for empathy, guilt, fear, and horror that prevent most other human beings from injuring each other under normal circumstances. Fortunately, however, sociopaths comprise only a tiny percent of the population, 2% according to the American Psychiatric Association. Everyone would not be killing each other in a system of anarchy. Most humans have both strong moral obligations and strong negative feelings about violence and theft. The same number of sociopaths might exist in both systems, but the anarchist system would be far more optimal, especially since it's more likely a sociopath rises to power in a governmental system. I now wish to address a few common counterarguments. These are real-life counterarguments I have heard from real people, as I have shared my views with others. Transportation. Without governments, there would be nobody to build the roads, or there would be far less roads that are connected, or it would be far more chaotic and less efficient than it is today. Actually, individuals in the market do create roads. They created the first roads. The original highways, turnpike roads, were actually private roads. The utilitarian argument that the market continually weeds out inefficiency also applies to roads. Did you know that 40,000 people die on government highways in the US each year? Yet we freak out about tragedies with far fewer deaths, and yet nobody ever talks about this tragedy every year. It is reasonable to argue that free market roads would be far safer. Competing roads would compare death tolls amongst each other and find innovative ways to protect their consumers, whether it's tweaking with speeds in different lanes, lane sizes, different rules for trucks, or whatever it may be. There would not be drastically different rules between the roads, but the market would discover the optimal standards of safety and suboptimal road managers would go out of business. Competing roads would also find innovative ways to limit traffic congestion with peak load pricing and other methods. Road owners and managers' very livelihood depends on satisfying the consumer. With government roads, there's no innovation, no progress, and no care for the consumer. Law and justice. Without governments, there would be no source or enforcement of law, so there'd be chaos. Or there would be unjust laws created and enforced by powerful defense agencies. In his book, The Problem of Political Authority, Michael Huemer explains that there would be two sources of law in an anarchist system. First would be property owners, who might consult legal scholars about standardized legal codes and would specify the body of law to govern interactions on their property. Arbitrators would likely honor the owner's choice of law. Consumers would vote with their feet against objectionable laws. Second would be the arbitrators themselves. Arbitrators would look to previous cases that most observers regard as fair as guidance in their decisions. Property owners, arbitrators, judges, protection agencies, and those who enforce common or market law have an incentive to act according to what the market regards as fair and just. This is unlike existing governmental systems, which have a distorted incentive structure, monopolistic characteristics, and a lack of accountability, which repeatedly results in injustice. Law is best made through contracts and by judges, rather than by a legislature. Now, protection and security. Without governments, we'd have no way of protecting ourselves from domestic or foreign enemies, or we would be far less safe. Private security and police are far more efficient and increasingly preferred over existing public police or protection systems. Murray Rothbard, in his book For a New Liberty, discovered that the private protection industry has expanded greatly while experiencing increased efficiency and lower prices. Government police has done the exact opposite. As far as foreign enemies are concerned, Very small militaries have efficiently fought off far bigger and more advanced militaries invading their country. Note the example of the Vietnam War and guerrilla warfare. The US was far superior to the Viet Cong, and yet year after year, American forces were unable to subdue their opponents until the US finally admitted defeat and withdrew all forces. Also, it is far more difficult to conquer an ungoverned territory than a nation state. With a nation state, all you have to do is convince the existing government to surrender through a series of attacks and other means. By contrast, the task of taking control of an ungoverned society is much more complex. Since there are many societies with that apparatus, an anarchist society is not likely to be the most attractive target for an expansionist regime. As I have heretofore demonstrated, there is no doubt in my mind that an anarchist society would be far superior to the existing governmental structure. I cannot possibly address all of the common counter-arguments one would have against my claim in the allotted time. So please come up to me after, or feel free to email me, and I would be happy to expand on my viewpoints. So yes, I'm an anarchist, and feel you should be too. If anything, I hope these arguments have caused you to think and reconsider your own political philosophy. Thank you.